Hey everybody, welcome back, Genesis fans. We are finally picking up the pace and continuing the Genesis album review series. The last video I made was way fucking back. I think the last one was back in November, October, or something like that. It's been a while since I reviewed a Genesis album, and I was on a roll back then. I was reviewing album after album. Then when I got to Wind and Wuthering, I don't know what it was. I started listening to other albums, other music, and my heart wasn't in the right place. So I thought, you know what? Rather than forcing out a review, let me wait until inspiration strikes when I'm back into Genesis. And I'm always into Genesis. As you guys all know, they're one of my favorite bands of all time. But I do take breaks sometimes, explore new music, explore different things before, ultimately going back to that band that I love, that's so near and dear to my heart. And today I was thinking about it, and I thought the time was right to review. And then there were three. The eighth Genesis album, released in 1978. And this one here, it's a really controversial album, a really underrated album, I would say. Honestly, it's not like one of the absolute greatest Genesis albums. I'd say it's one of the middle of the road ones. I believe on my Genesis ranking video, it was number 9, I think, out of their 15 studio albums. So closer to the bottom than the front. But Genesis have so many fucking masterpieces that coming in at number 9 is a very, very respectable position. And I do think that this is a great album. I mean, this is probably my second favorite album post Wind and Wuthering. My favorite being Duke. That's no surprise because I have a really big soft spot for that album. But this one here is a close second, and it's really transitional. It's a really transitional album. Has a lot of songs on it, about 11, I think 10 or, yeah, 11 songs on the album. And this album is seen as the album where Genesis really, not sold out, but they really started delving into more commercial territory. Again, they had the hit single Follow You, Follow Me with this album. And of course, Steve Hackett left the band, hence the name, and then there were three. And really, it just shows Genesis exploring tighter, more succinct, more commercially viable song structures and formats, trying to appeal to a wider audience. But I think that's an oversimplification of it. I think at its core, this album here is a transitional album, okay? Because it still has so many of those progressive elements from earlier on. And I don't think Genesis ever lost their progressive touch. I mean, look at the album Abacab. Okay, you might hate that album, but you have to admit, that album's adventurous. That album's experimental. So Genesis never really lost that experimental touch. But I will agree that this album here has a lot less in common with the classic progressive rock movement than albums like Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering. But it's still a great collection of songs, and it does have those elements. So although there isn't a full-blown prog epic, like 20-minute, 10-minute track, Wind and Wuthering didn't have one of those. Oh, it did have one for the Vine. And although Steve Hackett's missing, and it does suffer for that, I still think that this album deserves a lot more praise than it gets. And even from the first time I heard this album, I really enjoyed it. And I thought that all the negativity towards it, because we all know the Genesis fan base is extremely divided. A lot of fans think that everything after Wind and Wuthering sucks ass. Even more extreme fans think everything after The Lamb sucks ass. And then you have other fans that say this is kind of a mediocre album, a transitional album, but the last of their decent ones. Now, I'm neither of those people. I think I give this album a little bit more credit than most, because this album here, this album, Duke, and Abacab, I consider a trilogy of transitional albums. This one here, I think it's the start of that, has the most progressive elements. Duke was kind of like a middle ground between the poppy explorations of Abacab and the experimentation of the early form of Genesis. And in that sense, it was the apex of the transitional period. And Abacab was just a full transition into just madness, which kind of carried on into like their pop years, I would say. But yeah, Duke is definitely the apex for me. But this one here is a close second. So I really like the album, and without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the history behind it, because it's a really interesting backstory behind this, and really just showing how Genesis were the cockroaches of progressive rock. I mean, you could not get these guys down no matter what trials and tribulations they faced. They always progress forward. So let's get into that. Alright, so the history of Genesis continues. And I think where we left off in the last video was the Wind and Wuthering tour, which was actually a really successful tour for Genesis. Everything seemed to be looking up for them, because Wind and Wuthering, although it was an experimental album, although it was a little bit more inaccessible to some, it did do pretty well for the band. They kept their fan base full force. They were selling out bigger arenas, bigger stadiums. Obviously not like the same actually, I shouldn't say arenas and stadiums, but they were selling out bigger venues than they used to. And it seemed like they were just weathering the loss of Peter Gabriel fantastically. Again, releasing 2 albums in 1976. And the band was riding high. Now, it's also worth mentioning that um, during or after the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway sessions, Steve Hackett actually went off and recorded an album called The Voyage of the Acolyte, which is a highly regarded album. And this is a review for a different day. But to summarize my opinion on it, I tend to think that that album might be a little bit overrated. And again, hate using the word overrated and underrated, but I seem to like that album a lot less than most people. And not that it's a bad album by any sense of the imagination, but by any stretch of the imagination, I should say. But I don't think it's as adventurous, as progressive as Genesis, or as interesting. And the songwriting just isn't there on some of the tracks. But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is Steve Hackett had a lot of ideas, and he was kind of suppressed by Genesis. Genesis was pretty much ruled by an iron fist at that point, by Tony Banks and Peter Gabriel, and before Peter Gabriel left. And Mike Rutherford and Phil Collins were just content going with the flow. Just they didn't really care that that the band had such strong personalities writing a lot of the music. And that's not to say that Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford didn't write a lot, because they totally did. But usually when they did, it was in conjunction with Tony Banks as well. Like, for example, the Apocalypse and 9/8 section and the Cinema Show. But they were happy about it. But Steve Hackett was a little bit more restless. He had a lot of ideas. His creativity was just bursting at the seams. And he felt that all of his ideas were suppressed in Genesis, especially on Wind and Wuthering, which is kind of ironic because he did get a lot of chances to shine on that album. Again, my favorite track being Blood on the Rooftops, one of my all-time favorite songs of all time. Sorry. And he did have a few standout moments on that album, so it's surprising that that was the album that broke the camel's back. But the story goes that he had this song called Please Don't Touch, which we all know would be the title track of his second album. Fantastic instrumental. But the band opted to put Phil Collins' jazz fusion weird exploration called What Gorilla on the album, which for me is clearly a weaker song than Please Don't Touch. And Steve Hackett just couldn't get past that. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So he went on tour, but he had the intention of leaving because he really wanted to see how well he could do on his own. He really thought that the band wasn't big enough for him, or the band was too small for him. His ideas were just being stifled and suppressed, and he couldn't fully express himself as a musician. So that's a good reason to leave a band, if any. But again, it's just weird how it was on Wind and Wuthering, where he made a pretty big impact, a pretty big contribution. But anyway, so they went on tour, did the Seconds Out live album, and they were in the process of mixing it. And this is where our story begins. So Steve Hackett really, he had the intention of leaving, and Phil Collins kind of caught on to it. They would have these big group dinners some nights, and they'd be drinking. And, once Steve Hackett went over the edge, drank a lot, and he pretty much made his opinions that he's been kind of suppressing, made him clear to the band. He's saying, we're a band of 4 people. Why can't we all get 25% of the cut? And things like that. And again, he's a quiet guy, but I guess put some liquor into him, and the truth comes out. So Phil Collins caught on to that, and Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford kind of didn't really make much of it. But it came as a shock to them, because one day Steve Hackett, he was supposed to be at the mixing sessions for the Seconds Out live album, and Phil Collins was on the way there. He was driving, and he saw Steve Hackett walking down the road. And he said, "Steve, like, get in. I'll give you a lift to the studio." And Steve's like, "No, it's okay. I'll walk. I'm good." So Phil Collins drove to the studio. He arrived, and Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford looked pretty depressed. And Phil was like, "What the fuck's going on?" They're like, "Didn't you know? Steve Hackett just called us. He's leaving the band. He's out." And Phil Collins was shocked. And then later on, he ended up finding out that Steve Hackett said that he was the only person, Phil Collins that is, that could have convinced him otherwise. And if he got into that car with Phil, he would have still been in Genesis. So just imagine if Steve had a change of heart, got into that car, and the rest would have been history. But alas, that's not what went down. And Steve Hackett left the band, went on to a prolific solo career, and there the 3 guys were. Now, normally under these circumstances, a band like this would consider throwing in the towel when their longtime guitar player just up and leaves the band. And again, Steve Hackett being such a unique guitar player, so integral to the Genesis sound. Although, he wasn't as integral as the keyboard playing. His guitar lines and solos have always been a highlight in the band. You would think they would consider throwing in the towel. But no, not Genesis. Genesis was the most resilient band of all time. They had survived Anthony Phillips leaving the band back in 1970, which kind of sounds funny when you think about it because he was only on one album. But at the time, they were really thinking of throwing in the towel. They survived that with flying colors. They survived Peter Gabriel, their lead fucking singer, an iconic lead singer. He had the image, he had everything. They survived him leaving the band and even were more successful without him. So at this point, Genesis were really cocky. And, they thought that, okay, you know what? Steve's leaving the band. We can adapt. We can morph to the scenario and really bounce back strong. And what do? So at first they were considering auditioning other guitar players. But at the end of the day, Mike Rutherford was up to the challenge. He already played a lot of rhythm guitar in the band, and he was their longtime bass player. And he thought, you know what? Like, I could do this. I could play the fucking guitar. So again, just like with Phil Collins, they promoted from within, and Mike Rutherford assumed lead guitar duties. Now, right from the get-go, Mike Rutherford had no illusions about replicating the Steve Hackett sound. He knew that, Steve Hackett was such a unique player, and there was no way in hell he can replicate his unique sound. But he was up to the challenge of doing his own thing on the guitar, and he thought, why not? I mean, like, I have the skills, I have the capabilities, and the rest is history. And then there were three. And again, the band were really confident because those three members, Phil, Mike, and Tony, they had written some of the most musically complex sections of Genesis songs. Apocalypse and 9/8, the ending of the Cinema Show, and a lot of the Trick of the Tail album. Because again, at this point, Steve Hackett was into that Voyage of the Acolyte phase. He was kind of doing his own thing. And it was really up to those three members to write the core kind of basic song structures from that album. So yeah, really interesting stuff. And now that I mentioned that, that's probably the reason why Steve Hackett left after Wind and Wuthering, because he had less of a contribution on Trick of the Tail. So you'd think, like, why wouldn't he leave after that album? That's probably why, because he probably understood that because he was doing his own solo album, Genesis was kind of a secondary thing at that point, and it kept him happy. But with Wind and Wuthering, no solo album in sight, he was getting restless. So that just came to my mind right now. But anyway, so they went into the studio and wrote and recorded this album. And, we got to understand the time period these guys were in. It's 1978, and I know I sound like a broken record. Every single time I talk about a late 70s album, I got to mention the P word. The punk genre was really, really rising, and that genre was classified or exemplified by short, poppy hooks, minimal instrumentation, really anti-intellectual. And again, I dislike the punk genre a lot, to be honest with you guys. But at this point, a lot of the progressive rock contemporaries of Genesis, yes, Vandergraaf Generator, King Crimson, all the greats, Jethro Tull was still going, actually, but ELP was gone. They were all falling by the wayside. They were out of fashion, and Genesis knew that, honestly, to survive, they had to adapt. Maybe they didn't have to totally rehaul their sound, but they did have to really shorten it up, really get rid of those long instrumental passages and epics just to survive. And at that point, it was like a life or death scenario. So considering the circumstances in the music genre, it was either adapt or die. Like, the record label would literally drop you. So you really can't blame Genesis for really stripping down their songs a bit on this album. But you really got to give them credit for still, as I mentioned, still incorporating a lot of those progressive rock elements. So look on the bright side. Be a glass half full kind of guy rather than a glass half empty. Given the circumstances of the band, this is not a sellout album because it does have those progressive elements. Anyway, so they went into the studio, recorded the album. It was pretty relaxed. At this point, they all had families. And Phil Collins was moved into a new flat with his wife, so he didn't really have a lot of time to practice and write stuff on the drums. So he was content just being kind of like a sideman on this album and just singing and not really writing much. He did write a few songs co-written with Tony Banks, but largely this was a Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford dominated album in terms of the songwriting, and it really shows. I mean, Tony Banks is all over this fucking album with his synthesizer, which is sometimes a little bit overbearing. I mentioned on the previous review, Wind and Wuthering, that sometimes he goes over the top with his in-your-face synthesizer, and especially now that Steve Hackett's gone, you don't really have that contrast, that balance. But yeah, so very heavily dominated by Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. So, but still some great compositions. So let's see. So at this point, let me just check in my notes here. Oh yeah, so they went into the sessions with pre-formed songs. So Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, they separately wrote their songs and came into the studio prepared just to record them. Phil Collins wasn't a big fan of that. You know, he's always been a jazz guy. He's always been into the improv and into the experimentation. And he didn't really like the tight, you know, songwriting philosophy of writing a song pre-hand and then going into the studio, presenting it to your bandmates and recording it. So Phil Collins wasn't a big fan of that, but alas, that's what the album ended up being. And yeah, so they had a lot of Follow You Follow Me, the number one single from this album. They actually intended to expand that into like a 5-6 minute song apparently. I wonder what that would have sounded like. But they went into the studio, recorded it, ended up stripping it down to a 3-minute track. And their producer at the time, I think his name was something Herschel, David Herschel or something. Yeah, David Herschel or Hanschel. I can't pronounce this shit. He wasn't a big fan of it. He's like, it's a little bit simplistic. But then when they presented that to the record execs, they fucking love that shit. They're like, that's a hit, guys. And sure enough, it was. It was their highest charting single, even higher than I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, which is hilarious how that even charted because it's such a weird song. But yeah, the album did very well. Went to number 3 in the UK, and I believe it went to number 14 in the US, which is good. Went gold, then went platinum by 88. So really successful album for the band. Really started to propel them into that commercial territory. And yeah, so pretty good for the most resilient band of all time. The tour was nice. They ended up getting Daryl Strumer on guitar during their live performances. Again, from the jazz fusion realm. And again, just getting into that genre recently just opened my eyes to this guy because he's been in a lot of pretty highly regarded bands. Usually he's thought of as kind of like this weird guy who misinterprets Steve Hackett's solos. But honestly, how could you fucking replicate Steve Hackett? He's just one of a kind. So give Daryl Strumer a break. He does a great job on the guitar. And originally, funny enough, they wanted to get Weather Report's bass player, Alfonso Johnson, I believe, or Jansen, who was a bass player, but he also seemed to play the guitar. But, you know, his style ultimately didn't mesh with the band, and, it didn't really work out. So they ended up getting Daryl Strumer for the live performances. Still had Chester Thompson there, and on the drumming. And yeah, it was a pretty good tour. They brought back the Fountain of Salmacis. I thought I'd mention that because it's such an obscure song, and it really just goes to show how they never really ditched that progressive rock edge. Even in the 80s, they were playing the fucking Fountain of Salmacis, so that really says a lot. But anyway, guys, that's pretty much all I got to say about the history behind this album. Now let's dive into the overall review. All right, so now for the overall review of this thing, guys. And, I'm going to start off by ranting a little bit. I know I do that in all my videos, but I think this video deserves it. I really got to rant about, people that say that this album sold out. And again, I kind of alluded to this earlier on in the video with the whole time frame of the music scene at the time with the punk genre and everything, and how this album wasn't a sellout. But a lot of these Genesis fans, they seem to say that everything after Wind and Wuthering sucks, and they berate the band for it, and they give them shit, and they say they sold out, and they weren't true to themselves, and they made simplistic music. And I completely disagree with that bullshit because, honestly, think about it. First of all, Genesis, number one, Genesis had released 7 fantastic progressive rock albums before this. Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England, The Lamb, Trick of the Tail, and Wind and Wuthering. 7 progressive rock masterpieces, okay? At that point there, it's time for the band to move on, especially given the circumstances. Let's say they made another amazing progressive rock album. Sure, that's just one more for you guys to enjoy. But 7 is a lot. I'd understand if they made 2 or 3 great progressive albums, then went into more simplistic songwriting. That would kind of be a disappointment. But 7 albums, guys, get over that fucking shit, because 7 albums is a lot to latch onto, a lot to listen to, and a lot more than most bands even produce in their entire fucking careers. So give Genesis a break. Number 2, this album here isn't a sellout for all the reasons I already mentioned, and it has a lot of intricate musicianship and intricate playing, really progressive elements, especially with the synthesizer. You got fantasy lyrics. and all that stuff. So there's still some goodness to latch onto on this album. Now, it is true that this album here is a little bit more condensed. The song structures are a little bit more succinct. Usually the songs are about 4 to 5 minutes in length, maybe even a bit less. And that was just basically Genesis trying to survive. And at that point, they actually enjoyed writing those shorter songs. As I mentioned, they had families at this point, and they really weren't thinking about writing the next big epic track to really rule them all at this point. They just wanted to write some good songs. And that's what this album accomplishes. So they went into the studio not really dead set to like blow the boundaries of music like they did in the past. They just wanted to write a few great songs, and it gave them a lot of satisfaction. Like, they really enjoyed writing short, succinct songs at this point because it had been so difficult for them in the past for some reason. Like, those long, complex passages, as ironic as it sounds, came easy to these guys, and that's, a testament to their genius. But they really enjoyed, and they got a lot of creative pleasure from writing these shorter, more succinct songs. So, really, they didn't sell out. They didn't do this on purpose to sell records. They did it to stay alive, first of all, and they did it because they enjoyed it and they were in the right mindset and the right point in their career to do so. So I applaud Genesis for doing that. Now, that being said, let's talk about the actual music on this album. This album has a lot of variety. I mean, there's some pretty intense moments on this album, like Burning Rope, the opening track Down Note, some fantastic drumming. Again, less improvisational than the previous albums. Like, you don't really get those jazzy elements that, again, tracing back to Selling England by the Pound, that Phil Collins was really advocating for, and Steve Hackett as well. Now, the guitar playing, I gotta mention the guitar playing performance by Mike Rutherford. It's good, but I do have to say it's not fantastic. You never really get those standout guitar moments, with the exception of one song, Burning Rope. But even then, it's not like Steve Hackett level. So the guitar playing is a little bit more simplistic, a little bit more in the hard rock vein. And, I've heard stories that Mike Rutherford was kind of inexperienced with the guitar at this point. He was playing the bottleneck guitar on one song with like the wrong hand or something. But he does do a good job. Like, given that he hasn't really had that much experience playing lead guitar, he actually does a fantastic job. But again, you don't get those standout, spine-chilling Steve Hackett guitar moments. I'm talking the Lamia here, guys. I'm talking Firth of Fifth, the Musical Box, those really powerful, spine-chilling, beautiful guitar moments. Blood on the Rooftops as well. So the guitar playing definitely suffers, and I really think Steve Hackett really contributed to the soul of Genesis. Okay, the heart of Genesis, we all know it's Tony Banks. I mean, the guy was a compositional master, but the soul and the spirit of Genesis, Steve Hackett's fantastic atmospheric guitar playing really fed into that component of the band, and it's lost with this album. So I will give the critics that point there, that Mike Rutherford is nowhere near as fantastic as Steve Hackett, but he gets the job done. So he's not a bad player by any stretch of the imagination. Now, that leaves a lot of room for Tony Banks to take over, and I will admit that a lot of this album is dominated by Tony Banks. The songwriting just reeks of the guy, all the fantasy lyrics. And again, fantasy, but in a worse kind of way than what Peter Gabriel would do with his fantasy lyrics, which were more based on surrealism. Tony Banks is a little bit more literal, and that could come across as being a bit cheesy. I'm talking about songs like The Lady Lies, Scenes from a Night's Dream, things like that. They just seem a little bit, childish, to be honest. So the lyrics definitely suffer, but that's been a problem since Peter Gabriel left the band, so there's no point in beating up that dead horse over and over again. So the lyrics were never the same. Until Duke. Duke has fantastic lyrics, given Phil Collins' emotional turmoil at the time. But that's a review for another day. And yeah, a lot of tracks, 11 tracks, so a lot of variety on the album. You got ballads like Undertow, absolutely phenomenal track like that. You get the short poppy tunes like Follow You, Follow Me, which I actually really like, believe it or not. A lot of Genesis fans hate that track, but I like it. And yeah, you get a lot of variety on this album, so that's a plus. Trying to see what else I got to say about this thing. That's pretty much it. So it's basically, think about it as a Genesis album with a lot shorter, more succinct songs, a little bit more commercial appeal. The guitar playing's a little bit more simplistic, a little bit more in line with the usual classic guitar playing of the time. Very heavily dominated by the keyboards. And that's another thing I should mention. Sometimes Tony Banks just goes over the top with the synthesizer. I miss the classical piano stuff he used to do. Think about songs like Anyway from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the intro of Firth the Fifth, the intro of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This album here is more synthesizer driven, a little bit cheesy in my opinion, but not bad. Phil Collins, what can you say? The guy's been a fantastic drummer. He did his whole jazz fusion thing with Brand X, and you could really see his drumming has not waned one iota. So he's really the one member of the band that still shines just as brightly as he used to. But yeah, not to sound negative, but overall it's a great album, a great collection of songs. The songwriting is still there, which is the number one thing I look for in albums. If the songwriting isn't there, then you could do whatever you want on the instruments, all the virtuoso playing you want to do, and it won't make a difference. But these are memorable, tight, hook-driven songs, and a lot of beautiful moments, and again, a lot of those progressive explorations with virtuosic playing that Genesis was known for. So those elements are still there, like crazy keyboard solos, random time signature changes. You get all that stuff, so don't worry. So anyway, guys, that's my review of the album. Now let's talk about this album track by track.
It's good to be here, how ya been? Check my bag, boy, where's my room? I sit on the phone, that's my game.
Alright guys, so kicking off this album, we got the song Down and Out. What a fantastic opener, guys. Definitely one of the highlights on this album. If not my favorite, then probably my second favorite on this entire fucking album. Actually, it is my second favorite, because my favorite is, will always be my favorite, but this one here is a close second. It's a really strong opener, really powerful, really energetic and intense, and pretty heavy for Genesis. So definitely a shift of tone from the airier Wind and Wuthering, which was a more beautiful, more acoustic-driven album with a lot of classical flair. This song here just pummels you in the face. And what really drives this track is Phil Collins. I mean, his drumming performance here is absolutely incredible. One of his best, like, post Peter Gabriel drumming performances. Absolutely heavy. So think more along the lines of his performance on Squonk. It really has that heavy-handed John Bonham influence kind of feel, but with all the intricacies of Phil Collins' jazz experimentation and freeform feel. So really the drumming on this track is the highlight. But there's a lot of other cool elements as well. I actually really like the lyrics. I just mentioned a few seconds ago that the lyrics are a little bit cheesy, and that's true of the Tony Banks written tracks that veer a little bit too much into the fantasy land with fairy tales, things like that. But this one here is pretty realistic. It's kind of an autobiographical kind of song in the sense that it's about a band that's been around for a while. And they're getting a bit old, and their record label decides to drop them, which is a pretty unique topic for a Genesis song. And it's a pretty cool topic, I should say. So I wish more of the songs on this album had that realism to it, but it doesn't. But Down and Out definitely does. And the keyboard playing here, I gotta mention, it's pretty awesome. Tony Banks breaks out the organ, giving it that retro kind of early Genesis kind of sound. But it has that intensity with the bam, 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 din, 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 din. It's a really cool melody opening up the track, and it's really intense. But I like how it kind of has this false intro with this really uplifting the guitar riff that opens it up. That really, sets up the song as being like a poppy kind of joyous kind of thing, but then it kicks into that organ and bass heavy riff, and Phil Collins' just vocal performance is really intense on this song. Probably one of his most intense vocal performances so far. Obviously not like Afterglow, that's probably like the apex of Phil Collins' vocals at this point, but he puts a lot into it, and you could tell that he's getting a little bit more comfortable as a lead vocalist in the band, which is really cool. But again, his drumming is definitely the highlight of this track, to the point where Chester Thompson, who was an experienced drummer, had a lot of trouble replicating this song live, and Phil Collins had a hard time explaining it to him too, because it's really intricate and really complex. So that really says it all. So in terms of the keyboard playing, okay, I already mentioned the organ, but Tony Banks performs this extremely proggy sounding keyboard solo or synthesizer solo later on, and it's a really free form, really all over the place, and pretty awesome, pretty progressive. So all you assholes out there that say this album was a commercial sellout, listen to stuff like that, because I didn't hear crazy synth solos like that on any other 1978 hits. So yeah, shove it up your ass. And overall, the guitar playing is pretty good on this song. Again, more straightforward, and you could definitely feel that that the guitar playing steers more towards classic rock kind of vibe. But yeah, overall, great track. I would give this one a 9 to a 9.5 out of 10. It's one of the big highlights for me, guys.
And there, wine flows from floss to glass and mouth as it soothes confusing our doubts. And soon we feel, why do a single thing today? Is tomorrow sure as I'm here?
Track number 2, guys, Undertow. This song here is, and I honestly think will always be, my favorite track on And Then There Were Three. It's an absolutely beautiful ballad written by Tony Banks, one of their most heartfelt songs. And, I feel like I'm contradicting myself because I mentioned Tony Banks' lyrics were kind of childish and fantasy inspired. But this song here is a big exception to that. His lyrics are just so touching. And there have been points in my life where this song just almost moved me to the point of tears. One time it did move me to the point of tears, and I thought I'd share this story because it was just honestly like such a touching experience. I was listening to this song on YouTube, and I don't know if the comment is still there, but I was reading this long ass paragraph of someone who had a friend who had cancer, and they would listen to this song together. The song is basically about, making the most of your life because you'll never know when your last day on earth would be, and knowing if it was your last day on earth, what would you do in that circumstance? Things would be a lot different. And that theme has always popped into my head sometimes, where I feel like I'm just wasting time, frittering the hours away. But if I knew I was going to be dying next week, things would be completely different. And it really just emphasizes the point that we have to seize the day, really make the most of our lives, and, not put anything off till tomorrow. There's a great line in this song. Why do a single thing today? There's tomorrow as sure as I'm here. That line there is just extremely powerful. And most of all, the vocal delivery of Phil Collins is absolutely incredible on this song. He really puts a lot into it. Especially at the beginning of the song, his vocals are so soft and velvety, and the music just sinks into your soul and just sends shivers up and down your spine. It's absolutely beautiful. And then once it climaxes, it's just fantastic because the song climaxes twice. And right after the first climax, you think it's over, but then it gets onto that really, really powerful chorus. And Phil Collins is just singing extremely high-pitched. And it's just incredible. And Tony Banks does a fantastic job there as well. So really the song, it's like Afterglow in that sense. It's basically the sequel to Afterglow, just as climactic. But I think the message here is a little bit more personal, a little bit more meaningful than Afterglow. So yeah, I've always been kind of baffled why this song here gets kind of thrown under the bus and Afterglow kind of gets all the praise when this song here is honestly just as great as Afterglow. But again, it's just one of those underrated, hidden Genesis gems that I think everyone has to listen to. The interesting thing is this song here was supposed to open up with a lengthy keyboard solo by Tony Banks, and the band kind of shot it down because there's so many keyboard moments on this album, and Tony Banks understood, and he's like, yeah, you know what, you're right, guys, let's just tone it down a notch. And I think it served the song a little bit better because it just adds to that heartfelt kind of emotion running through the song. If it opened up with this crazy keyboard solo, I don't know if that would diminish the emotional effect of the track. So yeah, definitely my favorite on the album. Some days I feel like I want to give this song a 10, other days a 9.5. So I'll just give it in that range, to a 9.5 to a 10.
He threw his badge on the floor and walked out. He's gonna give it a try. He left no doubt.
Now, track number 3, The Ballad of Big. This one here is kind of an infamous song on the album. Most people do cite this as being the weakest track here, and I got to agree with them on that. I'm not really a huge fan of the song. Like, I could tolerate it, and I do like the music during the verses, but the main issue with this track for me is just the lyrics. It has this Wild West theme that doesn't really fit in with Genesis, and the lyrics are just not very good. They leave nothing to the imagination. It's basically just telling the story of this sheriff named Big Jim Cooley or something down south back in the 1800s. And the lyrics are just really explicit and really cheesy, to be honest. I mean, the chorus of the song is basically just saying how does it go again? He must be mad. Big Jim got mad. It's just very childish, especially coming after songs like Down and Out and Undertow, which were pretty powerful, got the album off to a great start. This song here kind of sours the mood a little bit. And there's even this one line. I have no idea what they were thinking. The weather was hot and so were the men. What kind of... I don't know. I'm not homophobic or anything, but that may be the gayest line in Genesis' entire discography. So yeah, the lyrics kind of off-put me with this track. But let's talk about the positives. During the, I like how the intro is kind of misleading. It's this nice, airy, atmospheric keyboard intro. And during the verses, I really love the bass. It's really chunky, and it has this nice driving rhythm to it. Again, if you're not focusing in on the lyrics, it's pretty cool. The main thing is when it gets into that chorus, Tony Banks comes in with this very simplistic organ riff, the and you can't help but think, like, this is the guy that wrote the intro to For the Fifth. Like, what's he doing writing these simplistic organ riffs at this point? So, yeah, definitely not one of the best Genesis tracks, but I do love the kind of driving rhythm during the verses. Try to ignore the lyrics. So, because of that, I can't give this song too much of a low score. It's probably a 7 to a 7.5, but yeah, overall, not one of the best on the album.
Never, never know. There's a snowman.
Now, coming in at number 4, we got Snowbound. And this one here, I used to like this song a lot more when I was a bit younger, but it has really worn off on me over the years. It's not one of my favorites on the album. Again, this, Ballad of Big, and a song that would come later on in the album, those 3 songs, I could have gone without. And again, this is a pretty long album coming in at about 55 minutes, so a little bit of trimming could have done it some justice. But yeah, Snowbound. What can you say about it? I mean, it has that chorus, the "Hey, I'm a snowman," that's just repeated just way too many times. I mean, chorus repetition, or I should say chorus over repetition, is one of my biggest pet peeves in music. It's just a lazy form of songwriting, and I'm not really a big fan of that chorus. But what really saves the song is Phil Collins' soft, velvety vocals in the intro and the verses of the track. It feels like it really encapsulates the whole theme of the track, which is pretty disturbing. It's basically about a dude. I don't know if this is true, but my interpretation is it's a dude who goes out into the woods, ends up freezing to death, and the snow piles up on him, and then kids kind of play with his dead body, pretending it's a snowman. So it really feels like Phil's velvety vocals. It feels like a cocoon, kind of like Cocoon from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It really gives you that feeling of being trapped and encased, kind of like you're dying, but in a comfortable kind of way, like your brain is already gone at that point, and you're just trapped in the snow, freezing to death, but in kind of like a cocoon, warm kind of way, if that makes any sense. But yeah, it's a pretty disturbing song. Imagine the kids finding this guy's dead body and like snapping off his frozen cock accidentally, or I don't know, these crazy thoughts run through my head every time. So pretty disturbing song, and you wouldn't think it from like the kind of childish fairy tale kind of nature of the chorus. But yeah, that's my interpretation of it. But again, the chorus is just way too repetitive, way too cheesy, and yeah, not one of my favorites. But Phil Collins' amazing vocals kind of make this track, so I'm still going to give it a decent score of a 7 to a 7.5 out of 10. So kind of like the same level as Ballad of Big, just not one of their best tracks.
But keep in mind, don't live today for tomorrow like you were immortal. The only survivors on this world
right, then we get the next track on the album, Burning Rope, clocking in at 7 minutes and 10 seconds. This song is the longest on the album, and probably if you can consider one song the epic, this would be it. And this one here is definitely one of the best songs on the album, right up there with Down and Out and Undertow as being in the top 3 tracks. And this one here is a really good song, guys. I mean, Tony Banks wrote it, and it was supposed to be kind of like a sequel to One for the Vine. It was supposed to be about 10 to 11 minutes, but they did a bit of trimming with the keyboards, and Burning Rope is what we get. And this song here is just a really melodic song, has a lot of powerful climaxes, especially with Mike Rutherford shining with absolutely the best guitar solo on the whole album. And I really got to mention this guitar solo first and foremost, because it really is the highlight of the whole song. It starts off, just comes out of nowhere, and it gets really, really intense. And you could tell that he's, using the sustain on the guitar notes, not trying to copy Steve Hackett's sound, but really trying to create that epic kind of guitar solo that Steve Hackett would do. But you could tell it isn't Steve Hackett. It isn't as intricate. It doesn't really evolve as much as a Steve Hackett solo would. Kind of just stays in the same place. But it's really intense. And when you get the second climax with that solo and the absolutely, oh my god, the absolutely powerful second climax with that solo, it's a huge highlight on the album and a huge highlight on the song. So yeah, overall, Burning Rope is one of those underrated Genesis songs. Everything about it is really great. Some awesome melodies. It starts off with this kind of bombastic synthesizer intro, which is a little bit overbearing at first, but you get used to it. And it's kind of like the overture to the entire track. But then this awesome melody comes in, and Phil Collins really does a great job. I like the layering of Phil Collins' vocals on this track as well. You got it high pitched and low pitched at the same time, giving it this weird kind of this pretty unique and weird vibe, but I like it. It's pretty cool. And then when Phil Collins sings the line, "Don't live today for tomorrow like you were immortal," that's a pretty powerful moment right there. And again, kind of like the same theme as Undertow with seizing the day, which is pretty cool. Overall, I have no idea what the fucking song's about, but I like it. It also like has a lot of changes throughout, a lot of different melodies. So pretty progressive song again. A nice little break where he sings, "You climb upon a burning rope to escape the mob below." That part right there is just a nice little breather in the midst of the song. I like that part as well. It's really cool. So yeah, overall, a lot of highlights on Burning Rope. It's a really cool song. And again, the main synth riff that goes throughout the track might be a little bit overbearing. I guess that would be the only flaw. But overall, really cool track. I would give this one a 9 to a 9.5. I think it's a really underrated song and has one of the standout guitar moments on the entire album by Mike Rutherford. Probably the most intense Mike Rutherford guitar solo, now that I think about it. Can't really think of anything else he did like this. But again, yeah, the closest he would ever get to Steve Hackett. Alright, now we're on track number 6, Deep in the Motherload. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of this track, actually. I love how it has this nice, solid, mid-tempo, slow-burning kind of feel. Kind of gives it that heaviness, that dirginess that a lot of these Genesis songs don't really have. So, really cool track. Also, a really epic track as well. I think it also has a Wild West theme, but unlike Ballad of Big, it's actually pretty inspirational. Just going through this guy's quest for whatever he's looking for, whether it be fame, fortune, women, whatever it is. It isn't really revealed, but the title Deep in the Motherload is pretty indicative that it's probably fortune. But you never know, it's up to interpretation. But yeah, really cool song. I love the main synth riff of the track. It gives you that like epic yearning kind of feel, like somebody being inspired to embark on a quest. And Phil Collins drumming on this track as well. Just like Down and Out, it's extremely heavy, extremely heavy-handed. Kind of that bringing that John Bonham influence back into his playing. And yeah, I love how it's kind of like this slow-burning kind of tune. Really epic sounding. And yeah, basically one of the highlights of the album. I don't know what else to say about it. I like how in the middle it kind of winds down a bit into this kind of atmospheric, dusky kind of section. Which, according to my interpretation, it's him in the depths of his travels. Really, like if this was a movie, this would kind of be like a montage spanning a few years the protagonist really going from place to place and progressing in his quest. So really cool, and I love that little like synth build up, the bam, darn it, darn it, darn it, oh no, darn it, darn it, do 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 do. Then the drums come in. Go west, young man. Just a really inspirational song for me. It always lifts up my spirits. So yeah, Deep in the Motherload. I love this one. I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. It's a classic.
Many more will stand here too. The thing what I find strange is the way you built me up and knocked me down again.
Now, the next track on the album, Many Too Many, brings a little bit of variation onto this album because it's pretty much a straightforward love song. Again, a ballad, just like Undertow. But this one here is a pretty good Genesis ballad. I mean, this song here, it could have definitely been on Duke, being one of the more tender ballads, the more, heartfelt, melancholic ones on Duke. But here we get it on this album, and it's kind of a sign of things to come. Not like their absolute greatest ballad, because Duke has so many of those, but a really good one at that. And what I find funny about this track is Phil Collins just didn't feel good about singing it. Again, it was written by Tony Banks. And Phil Collins was like, I don't know if I could sing this, man, with lines like, oh mama, oh pretty mama. Like, Phil Collins hadn't sang anything like that up to this point. Again, think about it. He was a jazz fusion guy, experimental, and here Tony Banks was presenting him with this love ballad, this straightforward song, and Phil Collins didn't know what to make of that, which is so ironic because he writes so many of these kind of ballads later on in his career, in his solo career, but these were the early stages, and they had to encourage him to sing it. But he finally did, and he delivers a great performance. You know, I'm not a huge fan of love songs, but this one here just tugs at my heartstrings, guys. I mean, it's just a really melancholic, sensitive ballad. And I love how it climaxes and how Phil Collins sings, I know that I got it made. And the way he says made with that high-pitched vocal is really cool. It kind of makes the song for me. Not to mention the incredibly melancholic and emotional Rutherford solo at the end. Probably next to Burning Rope, his second best solo on the album. Now that I mention it, I can't really think of any other solo. So really, those are the only two on the album. But a really good solo at that. Really heartfelt. And yeah, honestly, nothing more to say about it. Many Too Many. It's just a great ballad. I would give this one an 8.5 out of 10, hands down.
Eating all kinds of food so close to bedtime.
Now, the next track here, Scenes from a Night's Dream. I used to absolutely hate this track. From the first minute I heard it, I'm like, what the fuck? This song's freaking horrible. And again, coming from Genesis, one of my all-time favorite bands, it was kind of disheartening. But I gotta be honest, guys, over the years, it kind of grew on me, and I've come to appreciate the music behind it. And I think what I really couldn't get past were just the extremely cheesy lyrics. I don't know what the fuck they were smoking. It's about this kid named Little Nemo dreaming up all these fantastical things. And again, the lyrics are so goddamn cheesy. So if you're focusing in on the lyrics, that's definitely going to detract from the song. But musically, it's really nice. It's really upbeat, really jaunty, really catchy. And I love the little cowbell and jazzy kind of drum flourishes during the verses. So musically, I actually really like this song. It's just the lyrics don't really do it for me. But yeah, like musically, a pretty cool song, pretty jazzy during the verses. And the synth is just totally overbearing at this point. It's kind of like a guilty pleasure, actually. So yeah, Scenes from a Night's Dream. It's not as bad as I used to think it is, but still not a fantastic song. One of the three worst, along with Snowbound and Ballad of Big, in my opinion. So probably I'd give this one a 7.5.
To dream out my dreams. There were kings who were laughing in the rain. They told me,
Man, Say It's Alright Joe, the next track on the album. This is one of the strangest Genesis songs, but in a good way. I feel like it's just extremely overlooked, extremely underrated. There's a lot going for this track. I mean, this song is one of the biggest surprises on the album. You know, not one of my absolute favorites on it, but it's pretty close. It's definitely in the top tier songs on the album. It starts off just really melancholic, really sparse musically, Phil Collins is singing really really tenderly and melancholic, and you think it has this feeling of loneliness and disillusion. Apparently, it's about an alcoholic just sitting in a bar thinking about his life, all his failures and everything. So you think it's just going to be like this depressing kind of slow burning kind of track. But here's the thing, guys. It fucking explodes. All of a sudden, this amazing synth comes in, and it just lifts your spirits up. I mean, it's such a fantastic climax. And Phil Collins really gives it his all, especially when he sings, "Shine On!" That line right there is just really climactic. And it really takes you by surprise. It's extremely symphonic, and a big highlight on the album for me when that section comes in, totally takes you by surprise. Then it gets back into the, the gentle "Say It's All Right, Joe" section, and but again it bursts again with that extremely climactic synth part, and wow, just one of the best moments on the album. Even Mike Rutherford, who was the writer of this track, he felt that it wasn't really working, but that when they came up with that synth climax and added it in, he definitely felt it. He's like, damn, like this song is so much better than I originally thought it was going to be. And but it feels like it's been going under the radar for years. Like no one ever talks about this track. It seems like to be one of the most underrated songs. So definitely, just like Burning Rope, Deep in the Motherload, and Undertow, this is one of those essential songs that, if you're not going to hear the whole album, at least hear Say It's All Right, Joe, because it's a classic. I would give it a 9 out of 10. I love it that much.
Come with me, I need you. I feel dark and I live all alone.
Okay, so the second last track on the album, we got The Lady Lies. Another one of more of the epic tracks on the album, clocking in at I think about 6.5 minutes. And this song here is just a prime example. If you want to show someone that thinks this album is overly commercial, overly selling out, if you want to put it that way, show them The Lady Lies and dare them to say that this is a commercial song. This song here is just great, and it actually took me a long time to really appreciate this track. I would say, rather than focusing in on the lyrics and the vocals, listen to the musicianship. Phil Collins is on absolute fire during this song. This is one of the prime examples of Phil Collins' more jazzy, more free-form, and intricate drumming, rather than that heavy sound that he was going for on Deep in the Motherload and Down and Out. This song here is really more of his just insane virtuosic playing, and it's fantastic, as well as the bass lines. There's some fantastic bass lines running out through the entire track, and it's easy to forget that Mike Rutherford, now that he's the guitarist of the band, he's still the bass player, so he's still laying down those classic Mike Rutherford bass lines, and I think that he's one of the most underlooked bass players ever. He's a great fucking bass player. Now, at the core, this is a Tony Banks song. Again, it's very heavy with the synthesizer, and the synthesizer riff at the beginning of the track just gives you that sleazy kind of vibe, which really suits the song, because the song is basically chronicling the tale of probably the horniest dude of all time. Everyone warns this guy, man, beware of this cottage in the forest. There's this chick there, she's a witch, she's gonna seduce you with sex, you're gonna fuck, and then she's gonna fucking eat you alive. So what does this guy do? He goes into the forest, and he falls for all her fucking tricks, bones her, and he can't escape what he desires, as the song says. And it's hilarious, because, yeah, he meets that same fate, and just really shows that, a man's brain is really in his cock. So, funny lyrics by Tony Banks, again, really medieval, not medieval, really fairy tale kind of inspired with the witch, and it gives you that whole Hansel and Gretel kind of feel. But musically, it's really fantastic, really jazzy, really free form, and again, it has this jazzy kind of loungy synth solo in the middle as well, which is really cool. So really, it's one of those songs that might take a while to reveal itself to you per se, but once it does, you really lock into those intricate drum and bass grooves, and becomes one of the highlights on the album. So The Lady Lies, easily an 8.5 out of 10. It's one of the better tracks.
It's such a perfect day to spend alone with you. I will follow you. Will you follow me all the days and nights that we know will be?
Closing out the album, guys, we got Follow You, Follow Me. The big single from the album, the big hit, their first big hit, and an infamous song among Genesis fans. You're either a casual Genesis listener and you love Follow You, Follow Me, or you're one of those hardcore prog fans who thinks that this is when Genesis really sold out. And for me, this song always holds a soft spot in my heart, obviously being one of the most commercially successful Genesis songs. I've heard this song throughout my entire life, and I can't really dissociate myself from all the great experience I had as a kid listening to this track. I've always loved it. It's just a simple, accessible, really, but the thing is, it's a sincere song. You can tell the band's heart was into it. They weren't just trying to write like a ballad or a pop tune just for the sake of that. They really had their hearts into it. And this song was written by Mike Rutherford. Again, he said it was one of the easiest lyrics he ever composed. Took him about like 10 minutes. And it has a really cool guitar riff opening it up. Again, that iconic doom 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 doom. Honestly, it's just a feel-good song. I don't get why people can't just enjoy it for what it is. I mean, it's just I really like the song. And in recent years, I'm sure you guys all know what this ad is, but there's an ad before every single movie. If you go to the theater and you see a movie, you'll see this, like, I don't know if it's still playing in theaters, but you would have seen this ad where it's like this really kind of sappy snowman ad where the snowman comes to life and they play Follow You, Follow Me, and it's just, every time I hear this song, I can't help but think of that. So if you're not a Genesis fan and, you're not big into their prog years, you've definitely heard this song, just based on that. But yeah, really cool song, really melodic. Love Phil Collins' vocals on this track. And the video is pretty funny as well. Just shows, I love he's wearing that baseball cap in the video. I don't know. That always gives me a kick. But yeah, it's just a great pop song with a great melody. And there's even a nice, really airy synth solo later on in the song. So again, keeping that progressive rock kind of mentality. Because, most pop songs don't really have synth solos. So yeah, just a really great melodic song that you could sing along to, really memorable, and one of those songs that brought Genesis into the spotlight. So you got to give it credit where credit's due. So Follow You, Follow Me. I love the song. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10, maybe an 8 at the worst. Today I'm feeling an 8.5. It's just a great pop tune. So yeah, that closes out the album, guys. So again, thank you so much for watching the video. And then there were 3, it's you either love it or you hate it. But I really think there are a lot of highlights on the album. Again, just running through the track listing, Down and Out, Undertow, Burning Rope, Deep in the Motherload, Many Too Many, Say It's Alright Joe, The Lady Lies, and Follow You, Follow Me. That's 8 fantastic songs right there. And the rest, those 3 other songs, they could have been trimmed, they could have been left off the album. But I think they're still like okay, I guess. But yeah, great album. My second favorite of the post-Steve Hackett years, and I really think it's an underrated one, guys. Also, I realized I haven't mentioned the album cover. It was designed by Hypnosis, who did a lot of the Pink Floyd album covers and a few of the Genesis album covers before this. And it's a pretty nice cover. I don't know what the fuck's going on with it, but I do like the sunset and the dusky kind of feel it has to it. It's weird, but it's a cool cover, so I thought I'd just mention that. So yeah, guys, that's it. And then there were 3. Comment below. Tell me what you guys think about this album. Is it underrated? Am I overrating it? I think it's a great collection of songs. And but yeah, the next album, Duke, definitely showed Genesis progressing with this kind of mode of shorter, more compact songs. And I really think that that's one of their later career masterpieces. One of my absolute favorite Genesis albums. I think it's like my 7th or 6th favorite. Probably my 7th. But yeah, that might be the next review, or I might just talk about a different band. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and peace out.